My name's Christopher Snowdon. I'm the Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We are here to discuss lifestyle freedoms, and we have three excellent guests with differing views to talk about this. I'll introduce in a second. First off, perhaps we should say that maybe we're begging the question a bit here by talking about victimless crimes. It is, of course, the essence of classical liberalism to, as John Stuart Mill said, to allow anything that doesn't cause direct harm to other people. We're going to particularly discuss the drug laws in the UK and also laws about prostitution, which are rather tangled and quite an odd set of laws built up over a very long period of time. And of course, people, including on this panel, would say that these are not victimless crimes, that there are significant indirect costs to the families and friends of people who become addicted to drugs, and there are direct victims of prostitutions, people are being exploited, and so on. And there are laws in place which anybody under the age of 40 would probably be so used to they don't even question. Laws about being forced to wear a seatbelt, being forced to wear a helmet if you're on a motorcycle. Issues that are still discussed in a very lively way in some of the parts of the world, particularly the United States, but taken for granted in this country. And there are laws on the horizon related, for example, to this, an e-cigarette, being talked about banning these in every enclosed public place in Wales at the moment, not on the basis of harm, not on the basis of there being any victims, but on the basis that it sets a bad example, that it looks a bit like smoking, that it in some way normalizes smoking. Similarly, outdoor smoking bans are proposed on the same basis, that it sets a bad example to children. So it's no longer necessary for us to have victims for things to be crimes, and arguably it never has. I'll introduce our guests here. We've got over on my far left, Julie Bindel, who is a feminist writer, the co-founder of Justice for Women, a campaigner against violence against women. And we have Benedict Garrett on my left, who is a former teacher, stopped being a teacher when the school found out about his emerging career in the porn industry, and is now a full-time part-time star.
If you can be a full-time star.
No, would be tiring. And on my right, Tom Lloyd, who is a former chief constable and currently is an international drug policy advisor. I'm going to ask each of our guests to speak for no more than 10 minutes. When we're getting up to 10 minutes, I will knock the table. And if we go much beyond 10 minutes, I will start banging the table with my head. So if I could ask, please, Tom Lloyd, to get us started. Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks for the invitation. This is a subject I love talking about, so I'm very happy. In fact, I'd talk about it even if the room was empty, and my wife sometimes chastises me for that. I say, I'm just practicing, and it is, after all, important. But let me just start off by stating my position as far as drugs are concerned. After over 30 years policing and subsequently nearly 10 years of working as a drug policy advisor, I've come to the conclusion that drug prohibition is a hugely costly, harmful and counterproductive failure. And we should move to a position where all drugs are controlled, which means access, and regulated, which means purity and strength, by governments, or at least on behalf of governments, rather than by criminals. Now, let me start off by just using a little bit of Latin to explain why I see a difference in the drug laws as opposed to other laws, and I think that bears on the subject of sort of victims and victimless crimes. And it's the concept of malum in se, and if there are any real lawyers, I mean, as a cop, you're not really a lawyer. You're somebody who hopes to get it right when you lay hands on somebody, and then with full hindsight and a long study of the relevant legal arguments, the barrister tries to prove you wrong subsequently. But notwithstanding that, malum in se, wrong or evil in itself. And these are the sort of crimes that relate to assault, to theft of property and the like, where it's pretty clear and this may be open to argument, of course, it's pretty clear that one person is doing wrong to another in a very direct sense. And governments, of course, pass laws on the basis of malum in se. But then there's the type of law which is based on malum prohibitum. In other words, the wrong is created by the prohibition of the act. So one can think in terms of religious observance, banning Roman Catholics, arguably not wrong simply to be a Roman Catholic, but wrong if the law says so. Similarly, you could apply the same thinking to homosexuality, and of course you could apply, in my view, the same thinking to drugs, that taking a drug is not evil in itself, it's only evil or wrong because it's been banned. And that's one of the reasons why I think we should look at the drug laws differently from some of the other laws which have direct harms. Now, I mean, I'm at a conference of libertarians, and so I could simply say that, along the lines of John Stuart Mill, and it was a long time ago when I studied philosophy and psychology at Oxford, and I remember virtually none of it. In fact, on reflection, I'm not sure whether the degree in those two subjects really equips you for anything in particular, but arguably it does enable you to try, and this will be tested today, to try and think, not always coherently, because that's hard for human beings, but at least to challenge. And certainly what I've been doing, and this happened early on in my career, was to challenge notions. And so, not that I completely challenge the idea of Mill saying, do what you want as long as it doesn't harm anybody else, but I want to add arguments to that. So even if that fails as an argument, my view and my reason for challenging drug prohibition is that there are huge harms caused as a result of drug prohibition. And so for no other reason, we ought to try and lessen those harms. And in my view, the evidence, insofar as it goes, shows that a controlled and regulated world of drug production, supply and consumption would be far less harmful than a world that we have at the moment of drug prohibition. The sorts of unintended consequences, it's hard to call them unintended now because they're so obvious, are the creation of a massive criminal market. $400 to $500 billion a year is roughly the estimate by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime based in Vienna of the value of drug prohibition to the criminal market that we have handed over to them. And along with that comes violence as a means of settling disputes, and of course corruption on a very low level, if you like, of individual law enforcement officers, but also of complete states. They say in Latin America and certainly Mexico, there's no way you can get elected unless you have the backing of one of the cartels. And in Mexico, it would appear that Calderon, I shouldn't really say this, but the president might have been associated more with the Sinaloa cartel than any other, and that could have caused many of the problems there. But inevitably, you get violence and you get crime resulting from the criminal gangs using it as a means of furthering their business, and crime resulting from individuals having to pay an inflated price, cannabis under prohibition literally worth its weight in gold, having to pay an inflated price, and because they're ostracized and criminalized, resorting to crime, prostitution, or other means to raise money to pay the criminals for those drugs. There's another consequence, which is the so-called balloon effect, which operates in two ways. One of the ways is when production, for example, cocaine production in Colombia is, to an extent, I mean, it's been a failure, done more damage to the communities and peasant farmers there than to the cocaine market, but there has been a slight reduction in the production of cocaine in Colombia, and there's been a corresponding balloon-like increase. As you press the balloon, it bulges out of the other side, of cocaine production in Peru, because, of course, the market still wants the product, and so the consumers still want the product, so the illicit market will provide it. And there's also a much more localized effect where local law enforcement efforts, which overall have completely failed, as I said at the beginning, can have a local impact, and they can depress temporarily the supply or availability of a particular drug, and that will lead users into using other drugs which could easily be much more harmful. And then the last unintended consequence is about the damage to people. I can sum it up by saying if you don't have a problem with your drug use, the last thing you need is to be arrested and prosecuted. And if you do have a problem with your drug use, then the last thing you need is to be arrested and prosecuted. We have people being killed by states for the fact that they mainly not use, but the fact that they deal in drugs which have been arbitrarily defined by various conventions and local laws as being those that we're not allowed to trade in or to possess. And this seems to me to be wholly against any concept of human rights. You could argue that if it was effective, then it might reduce the harms associated with the supply and consumption of those drugs. But there are two problems with that. First of all, it isn't effective. And the biggest problem that anybody will have with their drug consumption is caused by prohibition. Because all drugs are more dangerous when the criminals are in charge of their production and supply. And that is why about 1,000 people a year in this country die unnecessarily, because they don't know the strength of the product they're taking and they don't know what the contaminants are, because it is not a regulated market. So I'm going to do the chairman a favour and not go over my 10 minutes. I could quite easily, but all I wanted to do was just to point out that there are huge harms associated with drug prohibition, and control and regulation would not deliver perfection. We're human beings, we can't deliver that. But it should be treated like any other public policy, transport, education, health. By changing your current policy for a new one, you're not necessarily going to make things perfect, but you're going to make things considerably better. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that's drugs brought into it. Now we'll bring in sex work. Benedict, you are, I suppose, a sex worker.
I am, yes. Yeah, and in which case I'd like to start just by saying that because I work in sex work, I do sometimes find it a struggle stringing a sentence together. So do bear with me. And yes, correctly, you introduced me as being a porn performer, but I'm also an escort. You call that a prostitute. I don't care. It's the same thing. I receive money to have sex with people, off screen as well as on. And I'm also a male, obviously, stripper. In fact, I was doing that last night in the beautiful part of the country called Kingston upon Hull, or as people around there call it, Hull. And I was driving, well, actually, very well attended as well by about 450, or what can we call them, sort of victims of patriarchy, I suppose, who felt coerced. Well, actually, they didn't feel because they didn't realise, but they were coerced to buy tickets, to plan ahead, to want to go and see men taking off their clothes and waving their penises around. Each to their own. But they seemed to enjoy it. And while I was driving home, I often listen on long journeys to the World Service. And there was an interesting story on the news that said that in Holland, they're going to be closing 8 of their prisons and making 3,000 of their prison guards unemployed. And I thought, my goodness, how on earth is Holland going to cope without all those prisons and without all those prison guards? I think that's absolutely shocking. Because as we all know, in Holland, they have such ridiculous rates of crime, particularly rape. It's just out of control in Holland. We know that in Holland, women are treated as second-class citizens. They're maltreated across the country. I've been to Holland many times. I walk around the streets, and I'm incredibly scared all the time when I'm walking on the streets of Holland. And then I thought, actually, no, none of that is true. Well, not to say that they don't have rape, because of course they do, and they do have crime in Holland. But and I'm sure the rights of women could be better in Holland. But as far as I'm aware, they are treated no worse there than they are here. And then I thought, well, what about the fact there's all these crimes that the Dutch government has created in order to make homosexuality illegal, obviously, in Holland, to criminalize people who take marijuana, because we know there are very strict rules about that in Holland, to criminalize the evil act of pornography, of course, they don't produce any porn in Holland, of course, and there's no prostitution in Holland, is there? And then I thought, oh, no, that can't be the case either. And then I realized I'd missed something, which was actually the headline before that, that said, in Holland, there's now more prison guards than there are prisoners. There's more than one prison guard to every prisoner in Holland. And the reason they're getting rid of those prisons, and the reason they're getting rid of those prison guards, is because they don't need them. Because they just haven't got the amount of criminals being prosecuted. Now, the question could be, is the police force rubbish? Are they just not pursuing the criminals? Now, I'm a frequent visitor to Holland. As I said, I regularly go and tour there. And actually, despite what I just said, I actually feel when I'm walking around Holland, it is the safest place I've ever walked around. I've never felt threatened in Holland. I've never walked around on a Friday night, thought I was going to get my head smashed in because I looked at somebody the wrong way, whereas I frequently do in any provincial hole in this country. Let's be honest. Now, I just want to start with that story, and it was very relevant hearing that on the radio last night. Now, I sit here, and I don't want you to get me wrong, I do not sit here representing the sex industry. What I sit here representing is the right for the sex industry to exist, for people to make the choice to work in that industry, and for people to make the choice to access the services that that industry offers. If you don't want to access those things, fine, you shouldn't have to. It shouldn't be shoved in your face. But if you'd like to, and if you'd like to be employed in that, then you should be. And as a teacher, I have to deconstruct the question here. As I often say to my students, particularly my A-level politics students, make sure you answer the question that's being asked and not go off on a tangent about something else that students often do. And the question here is about, should victimless crimes be punished? Now, I don't do anything illegal. There's aspects of the sex industry that could be deemed illegal, however, how you go around your activity, but prostitution is currently not illegal in this country. The production of pornography is currently not illegal, and it's not illegal for me to wave around my penis in front of people who wish to go and see that in the form of a stripper. So currently, there is no crime that I perform. Do I believe that those things should be crimes? Well, obviously not. And do I believe there are victims? No. The question, therefore, we should be asking is, who do we deem the victim to be in this sense? And who is saying that these things are crimes? And on what value system are we calling these things crimes? Is it a religion that's calling it? In which case, why are we allowing religion, which should be, as far as I'm concerned, a private matter, something you choose to do? If you want to worship fairies and goblins, that's your choice. Don't impose that on other people. And who are the victims here? Who really are the victims? Now, in many cases, you know, and I'm not psychic, but I do believe that many of those people who are against sex work will claim that in many ways we're all victims, particularly people who are women are victims of sex work because it's controlled by men. It's the patriarchy controlling how women should be interpreted and how women should be treated through the use of sex. And in many ways, we're all victims of the society we're born into. You know, that we can't change that. We're socialized in so many ways that often we realize, often we don't realize. And we're all victims in that kind of general sense of the term. But is there any real harm? Now, those people who are against prostitution, those people who are against pornography, will make claims about certain things, and they'll throw out certain terms, almost in the form of propaganda, because they think if you hear these terms enough, you will believe them. And they'll continually throw out terms like rape, paedophilia, bestiality, for which we have laws already. Those things are illegal in this country. Now, I've worked in all those industries for several years. Pornography I've done the longest, over 10 years, and I've never seen any of those things occur in this country. So when I'm talking about, first of all, pornography, I'm obviously not talking about paedophilia, obviously not talking about bestiality. If they ever occur within those industries, it is the acts of rape, it is the act of paedophilia, it is the act of bestiality, which is the illegal act. Equally, and I do not deny these things might occur, and they probably do occur. Things like trafficking of people to work in the sex industry, people being forced to work in the sex industry as slaves, people being abused within the sex industry. But yet again, the act of criminality is the act of trafficking, the act of slavery, and the act of abuse. We don't blame, you know, let's get this right. The police and journalists haven't really got a very good reputation at the moment in this country. I don't blame Julie Bindel and ask her to be accountable for the fact that some newspapers in the past have been hacking telephone lines. Equally, I don't blame all police officers for issues to do with racism or issues to do with caressing of figures and all sorts of things that happen within police institutions. Every single industry has problems, and within every single industry there will be laws that are broken, but you tackle them with the laws around those things. No other industry do we say, well, you know what? Because some people within the media have been hacking phone lines, we're going to ban free press. Let's get it out. Let's ban it all. It's absolutely wrong. We need to control it completely. No, that would never be the case. The other thing as well that some people, you have to question as well here, is what are the motives of the people who are saying that things like sex work should be a crime? What is their agenda? And you need to ask me the same question as well, because you might believe I have an agenda. I believe my agenda is simply that I would like to live in a society where we have the choice to make those things, to be able to do with our lives that which we please. I know, and it's already been mentioned, that there's things that I do in my private life, because I don't describe myself as heterosexual, I don't describe myself as homosexual, and I hate the term bisexual. I do in my private life that which I wish to do, and I know that in some countries I would have been stoned for it, and in Uganda I'd be put in prison for it. And in some countries, it is deemed acceptable that homosexuality, for instance, is a crime. In other countries, there are things that I say regularly, like I did about goblins and fairies earlier on, that I would have been hung for, saying blasphemic comments. But in this country, we have the choice to make those things, make those comments, and thank goodness we do. But who are we allowing to decide what is a crime and on what values? So you have to think, first of all, what is the agenda of those people? And very often, the people who are anti-porn, anti-prostitution, anti-sex work, often they do have genuine concerns, which I share. I absolutely share. If anybody is being maltreated within the sex industry, we need to deal with it, and we need to deal with it with the existing laws. The police need to be more efficient in what they do. We need to work with the police. Anybody who's being maltreated within the sex industry needs to have more confidence to be able to go to the police if they are being victims of abuse in any way or any existing crimes. But what we do not do is criminalize those people who choose to do things just because some people don't like it. And very often that's what it comes down to. I remember being stuck on a train and overhearing a conversation between two women who were talking about a friend of theirs who they said was a stripper. And they were saying, oh, yeah, it's disgusting. I couldn't do that. We shouldn't be allowed. And I turned around and I said, well, hang on, I'm a stripper. So what is it you don't actually like about it? I said, oh, well, I just couldn't do it myself. And ultimately, that's what it came down to. Just because they couldn't do it themselves, they were saying it shouldn't exist. I don't think you should be bullied. I don't think you should be bullied by men in the form of patriarchy, but I certainly don't think you should be bullied by other women either. Just because somebody someone calls themselves a feminist, and bear in mind there are lots of people who are feminists who are very pro-porn and pro-prostitution, just because somebody has a vagina, that makes them no more a valid bullier of you than a man. You should be able to have the right to make your own decisions about your life, your lifestyle, and not be told that you can't do it just because they don't like it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel a little bit like a butcher at a vegan convention here. But that's nothing new. Let me just start by telling you what I am not and what I do and don't believe in. So I'm a feminist, not the fun kind, the radical kind. And I believe there's a system of sex class. So I believe that although there are very many nice men who wish to be in equal relationships with women, there is something called a patriarchy, which I'm glad you said before me, Benedict, thank you very much, which means that there is, it's institutionalized within every single aspect of all societies, and some women escape more of that than others. I'm a secularist. I'm of the left, but not the hard left. I like sex. I think that people should be allowed to freely express themselves sexually, and I belong to a feminism that back in the 1970s and 80s looked very, very long and hard at women's sexual repression and oppression, argued for non-monogamy, for an end to compulsory heterosexuality, etc., etc. So I'm very much of that school. I'm not a moralist. I'm not against the sex industry because I believe that we shouldn't have sex outside of marriage or committed long-term relationships. I also do not consider that the right wing, the conservative right wing, are correct on these issues. And I am against censorship, and I never speak of banning anything, okay? But Benedict said earlier that he's not here to represent the sex industry. And I'm pleased he said that, because to suggest that he is, and Benedict's someone that I have a lot of respect for, would be as if to suggest that an Oxbridge-educated black man who's head of a large private corporation can speak for black youth unemployment. So Benedict's sitting here, very articulate, and able to articulate those issues in a conference like this, means that he is not representative, not because other people in the sex industry are not articulate, intelligent, bright, and can speak of these issues, but because they tend not to get invited. And that is an absolute, whichever way you look at it, whatever your views are, that is the case. However, I'm pleased to hear your views, many of which I share. And I would agree almost totally with our colleague here about drugs. But I will say how surprised I was that the issues of prostitution, the commercial sex industry, is linked in somehow with drugs. Because surely drugs are an inanimate object, and women are not. Those in the sex industry are not. And I say women whilst fully recognising that there are men also who sell sex, of course, like Benedict and many others. But I speak about this as an issue of gender discrimination, because prostitution in the sex industry is built upon gender discrimination. I would argue that it's both a cause and a consequence of gender discrimination. So I wouldn't say that all acts of prostitution are acts of violence towards women or others in the sex industry, but I would say that it creates a context in which inequality, the buying and selling, renting of orifices, usually of women, creates inequality. And I would urge you to look at the experiences of the majority involved in prostitution in the sex industry. Now, this is well documented in every single country that documents issues to do with prostitution. I mean, yes, there's a massive academic cabal that reproduces same old arguments, same old cliches, same old nonsense about prostitution being the oldest profession. It isn't. About how it's inevitable, how it will always be here, how it always has been. That's not the case. Or why don't we talk about poverty in Africa or child sexual abuse as inevitable? Because let's face it, it's always been here. So there is an academic consensus on this which says, hey, sex work is really cool. And those that speak against it, including the many survivors of the industry who were far more at the coalface than Benedict, but are dismissed. So those that speak about the realities of prostitution are often seen to be very uncool, very anti-sex, very last season. So it's difficult. I'm here in a room full of libertarians. Your natural instinct is to be pro anything like that. All sex is good sex, apart from that where there's no consent. And even then, we're on very shaky ground between ourselves. So somebody mentioned being homosexual. I think it was you, Tom, said about if you criminalise gay and lesbian sex, then obviously it's only bad because it's criminalised. Well, I've heard many people on many occasions say that prostitution is a lifestyle and that, therefore, you can compare it quite easily, quite reasonably, with sex work, with prostitution. But actually, prostitution is not a lifestyle. It's not a sexual orientation. It is not a sexual preference. There are, of course, those gay men and a handful of some women who we hear about disproportionately who will say, hey, I love the sex in prostitution and I get paid for it. So it's a win-win situation. But actually, prostitution isn't at all analogous with being lesbian or gay. and nor is the oppression and the repression that's involved in it. So, to move on to what I think the law should be, I think we probably all agree on this, the law is an ass. The law is one massive fucking ass. It is inconsistent, it is punishing of those that sell sex, and I've been campaigning for 3 decades to remove all criminalisation of those who sell sex, men, women and children. It disproportionately targets those who are really causing no harm at all, and it doesn't know its arse from its elbow. The police are given targets which is more likely to be in Westminster litter and dog shit, more than the brothels where there are many abused women behind the walls, and it's not working. So we obviously need to look at where the harm lies. Now this question is, victimless crime, where's the harm? Okay, well, prostitution isn't a victimless crime. Just because you can look to individuals who say, I love it, I choose it, I enjoy it, doesn't mean that it has no harmful effect at all on wider society and how women are viewed, on how women are treated, on the psychological effects of those who've been long-term in the real coalface of prostitution. Those who might say, well, obviously it's a choice for me, I wasn't pimped into it, I wasn't trafficked, but still talk about the fact that they can't form relationships with lovers, with sexual partners, because they've had to separate and completely become someone else during that transaction. We can talk about how it's labour, it's work like any other, and secretaries will use their brains and their hands to make cups of tea for their bosses, and steel workers like my father will use their muscle, and there's all kinds of bits of our bodies that we'll use. But we are using those bits of our bodies, and we don't have to talk about consent with our bosses and with those we're providing a service for. We just talk about an agreement. When your plumber comes to fix your tap, you don't wonder if he or she is consenting. Consent is only a word we use when we're talking about a transaction that is sexual, prostitution, a commercial sexual transaction. Now, what does consent mean to you? Do you have sex with your partner or with someone you've picked up in a bar and talk about whether they're consenting or not? Do you ever feel like, well, I'll let him or her do that because I'm consenting? No, because consenting is a grudging word. You talk about free agreement, I really want to do this. You don't talk about, well, I'll consent to that. You'll talk about consenting to let somebody borrow your coat even though you know they'll bring it back smelling of cigarette smoke. That's what consent means. So when we talk about prostitution as labour, we can't talk about it in the same way as you using bits of your body to fix a dripping tap. Your body is being taken from you and used. And for many, they will say, well, it's my free choice and I allow that to happen. But the psychological effects on that for those individuals, which is well documented, is not the same as a plumber who feels that his hands are a little bit chapped from fixing too many taps. The issue of choice is obviously a neoliberal one when you talk about feminism and choice. The whole political landscape has been completely co-opted by the language of choice. So feminism was about a social collective movement to liberate all women. But now you talk about a choice to be an arsehole like Margaret Thatcher. Just because you've got just because you've actually got economic power. Do you know, I was wondering about your political affiliation. Thanks for that. Just because you've got economic power and you have a vagina does not mean you are a feminist. Just because you say, I am choosing to be a pole dancer, that is my liberation, I'm empowered, is not the feminist project. That is not liberating women. So I'm saying that the choice argument is contradictory to the feminist one. Many of you will probably be hostile to feminism. But as a feminist, I'm saying my problem with the commercial sex industry isn't the women or the men or the children in it who are selling sex, many of them making a choice out of no choice through a horrific background of neglect, of care in the system, of abuse, many of whom are just unlucky enough to meet a pimp or a boyfriend who's a heroin user and doesn't want to go out and rip off shops and people's houses like used to happen. The coercive effects of prostitution do not go away with legalisation. And to finish, I have been to every legalised regime except for those states in Australia. I've spent time in the Netherlands, I've spent time in Nevada in the US, in Germany, where there is state-sanctioned prostitution, where the state becomes the pimp. And unlike other industries that Benedict mentioned, you cannot take away the criminal element, the organised crime element from the sex industry just because the state takes a share of it. We have seen disaster after disaster after disaster with state-sanctioned prostitution. We have seen that women who are in prostitution do not want to pay taxes, that the pimps that then become managers by definition also are running illegal operations because people still want their abusive scenarios, young people. They still want women from particular countries who are trafficked in. So you've never ever in all of these failed social experiments in these legalised regimes ever got rid of the criminal element. And in every single legalised regime in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Nevada, trafficking and abuse in the industry has always increased, and these are government figures, don't take my word for it, rather than decreased. So I would ask you to look again at the myths surrounding this. Legalisation doesn't reduce abuse for the women or those involved in selling sex. It legitimises the punter, the brothel owner, the pimp. That's all it does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions before we go to the floor. Tom, Julie's just been talking about the psychological effects of prostitution. One of the biggest justifications for not sanctioning it. Is that not also true with drugs to a large extent? I mean, I sometimes wonder whether people who take a more liberal approach to this, including myself, rely a bit too much on the physical harms and the assumption, which I think is probably true, but nevertheless an assumption that the physical harms would be fewer in number in a legalised and regulated environment. But I mean, it wasn't really the physical harms that were the main reason that these drugs were banned in the first place. It was more of a, well, I mean, there was lots of different reasons, not many of them honourable, but I mean, a large part of it was, to put it simply, the fact that we don't want to have a society where people are off their head on drugs all the time and can't nail down a solid job. And you know, there are undoubtedly, I think, psychological effects, the schizophrenia risk on cannabis. I'm only citing what the scientific literature says. I don't know how large the effect is. But it's undeniable, for example, that LSD has sent a number of people mad, to say the least, because we know of it in the world of rock and roll. Sid Barrett, Peter Green, it's unlikely to be just that. So are you not focusing too much on the physical impacts rather than looking at the larger societal impacts and psychological damage?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And I think there has been a lot of hypocrisy around let's ban certain drugs, not others, for example, alcohol. And we know that was a failure from Prohibition after the Volstead Act in 1919. And eventually in 1933, you actually had mothers against Prohibition because of the damage it was doing to their children and their partners and the rest of it. So it's amazing how we managed not to learn from history. There is certainly an element of racism around, and principally the US perhaps led on this, in terms of demonizing Chinese workers who used opium, Mexican workers and blacks who used marijuana, and all of the reefer madness stuff that you may have heard of. Simply the lies, perhaps put about by Randolph Hearst and his corporation, because he was concerned that hemp is a far better product rather than the trees which he owned for producing paper for the newspapers that he ran. But when we start looking at drugs and the kind of the overt motivation, it was really health-based. And interestingly enough, one of the unintended consequences from originally the 1961 United Nations Convention, which really in the modern world kicked all of this off in terms of a global approach, was very much health-based. But what we've actually seen is an absolutely massive overspend on law enforcement as opposed to health. It's not quite a balloon effect, but it's certainly one of the unintended consequences that I didn't cover in my opening segment. And that's led, for example, to the US with 5% of the world's population having 25% of the world's prisoners, an absolutely disgraceful state of affairs, and largely driven by prohibition of drugs. Now, basically, anybody can survive on a managed titrated dose of pretty much any drug. Certainly the drugs that we kind of know as being, a drug can't be illegal because it's like saying a table is illegal. They're just inanimate objects. And what we're doing is we're basically infringing upon people's individual liberties to make choices and creating more harm by making actions around those inanimate objects illegal. But let's say originally it was to do with individual health and what might be termed societal health. And that seems to me to be entirely reasonable if you think about a responsibility as a government to create an environment in which people can prosper and do better as individuals and collectively. But the fact is that hasn't worked. And psychological damage, when it comes to drugs, first of all, the schizophrenia argument. Cannabis consumption in this country since the early 60s and 70s has gone up, 20, 30, 40 times. It's a massive increase. Schizophrenia, dead flat, if not slightly lower. So whilst there may be certain individuals who are prone to a reaction to taking a substance, for example, cannabis, there is no way that is a direct causal link rather than potentially a correlation between certain people and their consumption. What is striking is that the people who really get into difficulties and often turn to prostitution, and I think this is something which is verified by the evidence, are those who have existing psychological traumas, difficulties, or whatever, from maybe physical, sexual, emotional abuse as children, or for other reasons, and are taking drugs to self-medicate. There's really quite a lot of evidence that this is the case. So actually, if you have, say, a young potential schizophrenic, cannabis might well make that person feel better. And then subsequently, as their schizophrenia develops alongside the cannabis use, the cannabis gets turned into a cause by those who I think have another cause, which is drug prohibition. So I ought to give you a simple answer, is that it is, I think, spurious to blame drugs on for psychological damage. However, that is if you had a controlled and regulated system. Under the current system, where you don't know what you're taking, and you get ostracized and criminalized, then that's when we see people who either have existing problems or problems that arise out of their drug consumption, and I'm not denying that can't happen, that is exacerbated many times by the fact that their drug use is prohibited. That's the real cause of the damage, not the drugs themselves.
Can I just follow that up with what I hope could be a yes or no answer, which is if, and this may require you to use your imagination, but if it could be shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that there would be more harm caused in a legalized drug environment than the current drug environment, would you still be in favor of legalization?
No, I wouldn't. No, I'm here to minimize harm.
So in other words, it's not a philosophical approach. It's not that you believe that it's just wrong for the government to tell somebody that they cannot live their life in the way they choose. It's purely utilitarian.
Utilitarian. I'm not sure if it's entirely utilitarian, but without getting into that, I think a government has a right to say, you will not assault somebody else, malum in se. But they've got to think very, very carefully about the consequences, the unintended consequences, the harms that have been shown, for example, under drug prohibition. They've got to think very carefully before stepping into legislation around malum prohibitum, because that allows people to intimidate, to focus on minorities, and you look at history and the history of legislation, which picks vulnerable people and minorities and subjugates them. And that, to me, is hugely dangerous. And that's where governments really have to think twice. And if it's going to cause more harm than good, you don't legislate. If it will genuinely reduce harm, then that seems to me to be a legitimate opportunity for governments to step in and legislate.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Benedict, Judy's got a point, hasn't she, when she says that you are not a typical sex worker. You're far more articulate. You're a man. You obviously don't regret ever getting involved with it. And you use the example of somewhere like Amsterdam or the Netherlands as somewhere where things seem to be quite nice, good, developed Western society. Things aren't really the same, are they, for much poorer people in much poorer countries? I mean, the rosy picture of prostitution cannot be maintained so much if we talk about places like the Philippines or Thailand.
Well, I'm pleased you asked me whether I am a typical sex worker. The fact is, anti-sex work campaigners don't want you to know about people like me. They'd rather keep people like me a secret because they don't want to admit that actually there are people who come from similar backgrounds to me. I had no abuse as a child. I grew up in a very loving, lower middle class family in the middle of England. No complaints whatsoever. Yes, I chose to enter the sex industry. I've had no bad experiences from within the sex industry. In fact, I have been sexually molested in my life, but never within the sex industry. Actually within the entertainment industry on a couple of occasions. And they want you to believe that I don't represent a significant proportion of the people who work within the sex industry. No, I don't represent sex workers in the Philippines, and sadly I can't. They have their own legal systems and they have their own problems to deal with over there. And I would like to believe that there are people in the Philippines who enter it of their own choice, but obviously, every country has a different economic situation and people do things for their own reasons. And you say I don't represent. How do you know? Do you meet the people I meet? Now, I know an awful lot of people who call themselves escorts or prostitutes, men and women. No, of course, I don't know the women who are trafficked over. I've never met them because they're not people I would meet. But don't believe that I don't represent a certain degree of people. I know a lot of people who choose to work in this industry who come from very middle-class backgrounds, who don't have a history of abuse, who have done other jobs before. I know people who've worked in banking, I know people who've worked in the legal profession, I know other people who've been in the teaching profession, who choose to work in the sex industry, who choose to work in pornography. So, no, there aren't many people who will come along and speak publicly. And there's several reasons for that. Well, actually, there are some. I have been to 7 or 8 debates at universities over the last couple of years. There's been other workers who've been at other debates as well. So that's not true. There are other people who will go and speak. But there's another reason why many people who could be in very similar situations like me, just as articulate, although I don't necessarily think you have to be articulate to be able to come to these debates. I don't want people to be put off just because they don't sound like me. And I think that's grossly unfair to people who perhaps have some regional accent and they feel like they're made to feel thick because they don't sound this way. And even though what can come out of their mouth could be equally as relevant, can be equally as important as what comes out of my mouth. And in some ways, I regret the fact that I sound like the way I do because I don't want to sugarcoat the industry. I don't want people to think, oh, well, he sounds very nice. I'm sure, it's not really like that. He doesn't really represent people in the industry. And we'll invite Benedict along because he can put a sentence together just about. You can sound relatively coherent. And that's not fair because there are people out there who kind of do sound a bit more like this, or they've got regional accents or whatever, but they can put their points across as well, but they feel intimidated, first of all. I always get nervous coming to these debates, which is one reason why I'm speaking rather quickly, as well as I had a 10-minute limit beforehand, but I need to slow myself down. I'm far more used to acting and stuff on stage and playing somebody else rather than being myself. So I find that a little bit more nerve-wracking. So I'm talking about normal acting, not getting my penis out. There obviously is acting involved in that, debatably. But I get very nervous coming along to these things. So first of all, you have to be somebody who's confident to be able to speak in public, which a lot of people who might work as escorts, who are performers in the sex industry that's not the natural calling. Others as well may have personal reasons why they don't wish to be shown publicly. There are other people who work in the industry alongside professions. Like when I was a teacher, I wouldn't have attended one of these debates because I wasn't ashamed of my sex work, but I was made to feel ashamed because of the society that I live in, because I knew my employer would look down on it. I had no problem with it, but I had to work the system that I was living in. And so there's many people who work in this industry who advertise themselves as prostitutes. Some of them work in pornography, although less so in pornography because obviously they're seen on screen. although some of those do as well. They wouldn't want family to know. Sometimes it's to do with religion. They don't want people in their community to know about what they do, so they're less likely to want to come along to these events. So do not be fooled that there's only Mr. Benedict Garrett who sounds like this and talks like this within the sex industry, because there are plenty of other people. They work the industry in a different way to obviously those people who are trafficked over, and that's the unfortunate side of it, and it's the trafficking, the slavery, which is the problem. But there's a site out there called Adult Work. Most of the people advertise themselves Adult Work. They do it independently. There's no pimps involved. You advertise your services. People, to get in contact with people who work on that site, you have to contact them with a message. So they've made that choice first of all. You're not picking anybody off the street. You contact them with a message. I respond to the message. You to and fro. Sometimes you chat on the phone, or sometimes you ask them to send a picture to make sure everything's safe, and you feel that there can be some chemistry there, you feel like they haven't got some kind of attitude problem, or they're rude in some way. And then you talk about making a date, and you go along, and you carry out your services. But also, let me just reiterate as well, the service of a sex worker isn't simply about the penetration or being penetrated by orifices. It's a whole lot more than that. And to many people, it is a very useful service. I don't just spend an hour having sex. I turn up there, you spend often the first half an hour, sometimes it's the first time people have hired me, talking to them, finding out what they want. I've had clients from all sorts of backgrounds, people who've been virgins and wanted to experience sex for the first time. I had a lady from India who's a medical student who worked 7 days a week, 4 days in a row without any sleep. She would sometimes just grab a chair now and again, have 15 minutes kip, and then get back to work. But she wasn't allowed officially any sleep. She had to work 4 days continually, and then 3 days she had about 6 hours in between shifts. And she wanted to come to England to experience sex. And under current proposals, she may be criminalised because she's seeking out the services of people like me. So don't think it's just dirty old men seeking out women who've been trafficked over to bang them senseless, doing something they've had no choice to do. Because I've never met them, and I've met many, many people of similar backgrounds to me. And you know what? Some of them may have had problems in their childhood. Does that negate the fact that they can choose to do what they want to do? I've had girlfriends in the past who were beaten as children, who were sexually abused as children. Does that affect their choices they make in life? Why should it? You know, we all have the choice to do those things, and all of us have different things that have happened in our background which could explain certain things. So I know I'm rapping on there, but no, it is not true to say that I'm the only person here who speaks like this, who talks like this, who has this similar background. There are many others out there. I think does that answer your question, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. And just before we go to the questions, we've still got half an hour left. Julie, if I could just ask you, you talked a lot about consent and how we use the word consent in the field of sex work. We don't tend to use it so much in other areas. I mean, isn't that really just wordplay and sophistry? I mean, the point is that these people are agreeing to it. They are agreeing essentially to a contract to provide a service like anybody else in the economy. And also, I'm still 100% clear on if you have one, what your legal solution to this be. What should be the legal framework? You say you don't want things banned. You say you'd like to see all sex workers of any type decriminalised. Do you have no policy proposals of what should be banned in order to clamp down on this?
Like I say, I never use the word banned. I don't talk about banning anything. To take your first question, which was about wordplay and consent, no, it's not just semantics. Yes, of course, there are people who agree to this. I never talk about trafficking as a reason for human rights approached opposition to the sex industry, because any decent person will say trafficking is wrong. And that's why it's lazy, and it just creates a kind of unnecessary drama to point out trafficking, which is already illegal, as Benedict pointed out, as the problem within the industry. What you can't ignore, however, is if you didn't have a vibrant, largely unpoliced off-street sex industry, that you wouldn't have trafficking. It's as simple as that. And to say that you should look at trafficking but not the rest of the industry, rooting out the abuse, is like saying you should police domestic murder but leave domestic violence well alone, even though one leads to the other. So, of course, there are people who are freely agreeing to sell sex. Benedict's one of them. There are others I've met, talked with, who, are, in many ways choosing sex work as something, out of, let me just rephrase that, they have other choices, right? They don't just have that one choice. The majority of the women and men that I've interviewed, met with, campaigned with, who have said, yes, they weren't pimped, they weren't forced, but their choice to do this was out of no real other choice. So, looking, for example, at a man who decides to sell a kidney in order to escape from a war-torn country or a situation where, his life is in serious risk, to come to the UK, well, of course we don't criminalise him. My solution would be to criminalise the surgeon and the broker involved in this. So he can say it's his free choice. He's without the kidney. He's providing that kidney for a relatively rich Westerner, usually. Okay, so is this a situation that we think is all right? That some people sell kidneys? Yeah, of course you do. Some of you do. God, you're worse than I thought. Anyway, my point about that is that you have to look at the levels of privilege that exist in this room, for example, which is quite serious privilege, compared to those that really do make a choice out of very little other choice, out of very little alternative choice. Obviously, as libertarians, you don't give a hoot about that, but some of us who are political activists do. My solution, my legislative solution, decriminalise those selling sex, look at ways in which we can introduce proper public awareness about the harms of the sex industry, which means that then anyone that goes into it really is making a free choice. Criminalise the demand so that you start looking towards normative change in countries, for example, between the Netherlands and Sweden or Norway. So in the Netherlands, generations of young people are growing up thinking that prostitution is a service industry like any other, and there are some groups of girls and women that go into it to be spittoons for men's semen, which is how one woman in prostitution put it to me. Okay? And then you've got the countries that are dealing with this as a human rights issue, and generations of people are growing up realising that actually there are harms in this industry, and it is in contradiction to equality between men and women.